Warm welcome, everyone, to this evening's Classics Academy seminar. And this evening, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Thomas Husøy. Thomas holds a master's degree from the University of Edinburgh. He completed his PhD then at the University of Swansea in 2023, and his research focused on ethnicity and federalism in Greek antiquity. He is currently holding a number of positions. He is a research assistant in Swansea University, working across a number of projects in arts and humanities. He is also a University College lecturer for Western Norway University of Applied Sciences, and he is working on a modern history heritage project in Cardiff. So he said to me before we started that he's delighted to be talking about some ancient history again. So let me hand over then to Thomas. He's going to speak to us this evening about federal integration and uses of the mythical past in classical and Hellenistic Greece.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. Just going to share my screen there, and full screen it there. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. As Helen said, I'm working across a range of things, so it's nice to sort of be able to come back to my doctoral theme a little bit there, as I'm also working on hopefully one day publishing a monograph based on it. So it's nice to get back to it and look through the materials again. And as you said, my doctoral degree focused on federalism and ethnicity in ancient Greece. Now, when I first started my PhD, my sort of whole big idea around it was, let's just try to do federalism sort of beyond the institutional approaches. It took about 3 or 4 meetings with my supervisor, Dr. Maria Pretzler, and it was then all of a sudden turned into being all about genealogies and uses of the mythical past and all of these things to form the identities that forms federal states in the Greek world. So I'm going to be talking about that later. I'll be focusing sort of primarily on the regions of Boeotia and Anatolia. Boeotia being the best known federal state in the ancient Greek world, Anatolia possibly at the height of its power, the most influential one by quite a bit, even though Polybius really disliked them for reasons. The 2 images you see here are 2 of the sites that was quite important within these 2 federal areas. So you have the tallest tomb of Minyas from Akomenos, which I got to sneak into despite the fact that it was supposed to be closed the last time I was in Greece, but there was a guy at the gate who agreed to open it for me. So I had a nice sort of little visit into it. And the Temple of Apollo Thermios at Thermon in Anatolia, which is by far possibly one of the coolest sites, I think, in my personal opinion, in ancient Greece. And because very few people go there, if you do ever go to this temple and the very cool museum that's next to it, you have very few other people there, which is quite nice because you just go out for brand and do everything in your own time. So the main theme of this will sort of be how the mythical past is used to create federation. So I'll be looking into various myths, various stories. I'll be touching lightly upon them. I won't be going into too many details. But if anyone has any questions about any particular myths afterwards that are going into, please feel free to ask, because I can talk about them forever. Generally, a lot of the myths I'm using when looking at these things tends to be quite obscure ones, because they are the ones that is the easiest, also in antiquity, to change to fit into political narratives. Is the obscure heroes you barely know anything other about than the name. Those stories are much easier to change. But before we go into that, I will talk a little bit about the importance of cultural memories, use of the past and identity, as well as exactly what the federal state is. And in this next picture, I will have one that has caused some interesting debates around this next slide. Will have some interesting debates around heritage and history in Norway, my home country. And it's quite topical because it's directly related to the current World Cup. As the Norwegian team went over to the World Cup in the US, they took this picture dressed as Vikings. Because, or how we perceive Vikings in modern popular culture, we do know quite well that this is not how Vikings would have dressed. There isn't enough colors, for instance. But what makes this quite an interesting image for the purpose of today is the fact that this is a modern take on the Viking Age. It shows people in Scandinavia dressed as how we in current climate perceive the Vikings, largely because of popular culture such as games and the TV series Vikings. Uh, but Vikings is the Vikings and the stories of the Vikings, the sagas. There's something that sits quite strongly within Norwegian identity, as you can imagine, because it is kind of similar to ancient Greece for the Greeks for Scandinavians. It's the earliest sort of records we have. But this caused a lot of controversy in Norway in certain circles, thinking it is dangerous to portray this sort of association with the hyper-masculine past and all of these narratives. However, it is also a part that was a part of shaping the nation in the 1800s, 1900s, and the stories of the Middle Ages is quite a crucial part of Norwegian identity to this day, which we also see in the design of the football jerseys this year, where the lettering is shaped as if they're runes, and they have a pattern taken from a stavkirk, which is some very beautiful wooden churches that was built in Norway during the Middle Ages. Narratives such as the ones of the Vikings, as well as the Greek myths and Greek antiquity, they often form origin narratives. They lay foundations for ethnic groups in antiquity and the modern day, as well as national stories today. Vikings being an example from Norway here. And I just, again, the reason why I picked this particular image is because it's so recent and it's very topical about being the World Cup. And obviously, it has caused some debate around identity and history and heritage in Norway, which is very interesting to me as someone who works in both heritage and ancient history, do a lot of work on the importance of stories and myths. But the cultural memories we form that survives through generations, they are what end up forming the various groups' identities, including groups in antiquity. So groups like the Boeotians, they base themselves on a set of myths, which also features into how the federal state was organized. I'm going to propose some things in there that I will admit is at this point still somewhat speculations, but it's something I want to do more about that. I included in my thesis, and at the time, at least, my supervisor thought it sounded interesting, so I want to develop that bit further. So parts of this talk might eventually be developed into a paper. Now, stories such as the Vikings or the origin narratives of ancient Greeks, they can represent a form of history that can be used in various ways. Now, there's a Swedish historian called Claes-Göran Karlsson who sat down and identified various ways in which history can be used. He identified an ideological way of using the past, which means you're using history, or in terms of ancient Greeks, myth history, to shape the current narratives. The Trojan War is a good example there that was often used in classical and Hellenistic Greece to form new narratives. There's the existential use, which lies at the very root of every identity we have. It's the stories and past that explain who we are as individuals, who our groups are, who our nations are, who our ethnic groups are, and so on. And there's also a moral use of the past, which is the ones used to justify moral courses of action within various groups, which obviously can look different in different places. If you look to Scandinavia again, the narrative of Norway's break with Sweden in 1905 is told somewhat different in Norway and Sweden, because Norway viewed it as a moral cause. The Swedes doesn't necessarily view it in the same way. But such stories and tales of the past, they can sort of develop into a form of ethnic bonding. By ethnic bonding, I mean the stories kind of becomes one of the powerful forces that drives groups forward and drives argumentation within groups. And the thing with ethnicity and ethnic groups is it is flexible. It can change. New members can be adapted and so on. But some people, as we do also sometimes see in news stories and so on, doesn't necessarily like to adapt new members and like the adaptability of ethnicity, but it is a flexible concept, as we will also see as I go through the stories that I go through in ancient Greece. So it's a little bit on cultural memories and uses of the past and identity. Now, at the core of this talk and a lot of my work, as I said, my research there was to look at federalism beyond institutionalism, is federal states. So I'll talk a little bit about what federal systems are, what federal states actually are. because there's a lot of debate around this topic, just as there is with scholars who to this day cannot necessarily agree on what ethnicity or various types of identity is. There's a lot of debate around federal systems. The general thing people do agree on is that federal system is a system with a dual level of government. So there is sort of a higher level. In terms of modern federations, that could be the national level and then more regional levels, such as if you go to the United States, you have the federal government and you have the state governments. If you go to Germany, you have the various states there, you have the cantons in Switzerland as examples. Now, to be a federal state, there has to be some shared level of sovereignty within that. Because these constituent parts, they do have to have some degree of autonomy and self-governance for it to be a federal state. Now, in antiquity, we don't necessarily know the constitutions of the various federal states. We do have an idea of the Boeotian ones at a certain point, but we don't really know all of them in great details, which gives us a lot of flexibility around sort of trying to figure it out based on the evidence we have. In the modern world, federalism does make up some of the largest and smallest states that's out there, as you can see on the map that's there. Canada, Russia, the United States, some of the largest countries that's out there, and also some very small countries in the Caribbean makes up federal systems. Now, there's a scholar called John Law from the University of Oxford who created sort of an idea of various types of federal systems. He argues that federalism can sort of be divided into two types, which is the federal state itself, which is similar to the federal states we know today, so Germany, the US, and so on, and federal unions of states, which has more autonomy for the members than full federal states. He also developed sort of theories on sort of wider sides of it. So he views it as a process, and this can change throughout the country's existence. And we know, for instance, with the Boeotians that their system changes multiple times. But in his sort of listing, as you can see at the top graph there, there's a level called devolution, which is similar to what the United Kingdom is now. So in his view, the United Kingdom also makes up a form of a federal arrangement, if not a federation itself, because Westminster still is where both the power sits. Now, we do know now quite well in antiquity that there is a lot of these federal states around. At one point, I think about half of the Greek cities is in a form of federal states. I have here sort of taken included pictures some of the recent scholarship. There has been a lot of recent scholarships in the last sort of decade focusing on federalism. And these are some of the really sort of interesting volumes that came out with Federalism in Greek Antiquity by Beck and Felke. Economists work on the Achaean Federation. Ethnos and Koinon, particularly interesting for me, who likes to work on identity as well. And Greek warfare beyond the polis is obviously quite interesting as well. Greek federal states and the sanctuaries, if you like to look at religion and federalism. So there's been a lot of work on this. And hopefully one day my doctoral thesis will go in there as well. I was sort of throughout the day wondering if I should include a picture of Larsen's 1968 book on federalism, since that is still a very common reference to use on it, but I decided to keep it within the most recent decade, really, to sort of slightly more direct now with Emily's book, but to sort of try to stick to not put too much on there. Now, in ancient Greece, it becomes quite a common political system. They're often called koinon or sympoliteia. There's other words used for them as well at various times. But these are two particularly common ones. Koinon is how we often talk about them today. Most of these, I think all of them, as far as we know, seems to have had sort of two levels of government, so fitting with the federal structure. With the Boeotians, we do have 11. We do have the districts that is given by Hellenic Oxyrhynchus, which I'll come back to soon. And we do have, for instance, mentions of councils in the Arcadian federations, and we do know sort of little bit on the Aetolians, for instance, and how their systems work. Now, within this federal level is often based on ethnic identity. So groups like the Boeotians, that is quite established, is a ethnic identity, an ethnic group. The constituent, we know they have constituent parts. Some of them do actually also map onto ideas of ethnicity. If you go to Arcadia, the Paratians, for instance, is a group that has their own quite distinctive ethnic identity. And we do know that before before the creation of the Arcadian Federation, they did, for instance, seem to have had their own microfederal system. Now, as I said, they're often based around ethnic identity, but this changes. So mythical narratives can change, mythical stories can change, and new groups can be let in. Again, a great example from the Peloponnese is when the Tryphillians all of a sudden are related to Arcas in the mythical stories, and through that largely can be recognized as Arcadian by ethnic identity, and they get integrated into the Arcadian system. Now, there's a big change of them, sort of. My sort of sense of it is they start slightly before the Hellenistic period, but once we get into Hellenistic period, they become much larger beasts. They become much larger states. So both the Achaeans and the Aetolians in particular becomes large power players on the Hellenic mainland, Aetolia even to some degree rivaling the power of Macedon. And we have other examples of Hellenistic federal states. The Boeotians, for instance, remains a federal state for a while. They also, at one point, become sort of integrated into the Aetolian state. There's things like the Hanseatic Federation in the Aegean, which is quite a fascinating case there as well. So we do know these were quite common. There has been sort of an idea to sort of propose there were unitary states, but that's largely been sort of an argument that's disappeared out of the discussion at this point largely. And the discussion has sort of become more and more about accepting these as kind of federal entities. And with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the two case studies. My two case studies, you will see a lot of pictures through this, by the way, from my most recent trip to Greece, which is a few years ago now, but I sort of had a good chance to look through my images as I was preparing for this talk. On the top, you have a picture of Lake Trichonis from quite near Thermon, and at the bottom, you have a picture of the now kind of overgrown Temple of Apollo Toios, as an Akraphia in Boeotia. But wonderful sites, well worth visiting. The Boeotians, as I said, is the best known federal system due to fragment from the Oxyrhynchus historian. I'll come a little bit more into sort of why they are that, and that's where I would sort of introduce a theory I'm working on that I need to suss out a little bit more and trying to see if I can get it publishable at some point. Now, we do know this federation in Boeotia formed in the 5th century, sometime around 447, so after Athens was kicked out of the region after having a dominating period there. And we do see sort of increasing Theban influence within it. So it becomes sort of increasingly a vehicle for Theban influence, even though I don't think that Thebes ever in the 5th century was on their own powerful enough to sort of rule the whole thing. Now, the most powerful period, though, there can be no denying that Thebes did probably lead the show in the 4th century after the Battle of Leuctra. I'm not going to talk about that period, but that's the period when they have their most influence is the period following the Battle of Leuctra. Now, the other case study is the Aetolians, which is quite fascinating as well. There's some form of regional collaboration there already from the Archaic period. And quite early on, we can see quite the complex multi-level identity system, partly because Thucydides has this great passage where he describes them. It describes one of the groups in quite sort of a talking down on them way, claiming them to be raw meat eaters and speaking an unintelligible dialect and so on, largely because Athens lost against them. So I'll come into that. But they do end up becoming one of the most influential players on the Hellenic mainland in the 3rd century, which is why they're sort of my case study from the Hellenistic period, which a few years ago, anyone who talked to me would have said, I would probably, every time I get the chance to speak about the Hellenistic period, talk about the Achaeans, but the Aetolians have sort of swayed me over, so Polybius would probably be very upset with me now. Right, and with that, I will delve into the various case studies, starting with classical Boeotia. Now, this is an image, again, from that last 50 degrees, from Plataea, and looking into the region. Plataea is one of the sort of important cities within the region, near the Attic border. It's not really a very big city, but it's very important because it keeps causing trouble for the Thebans. But exactly where is this region of Boeotia? Well, it's a region in central Greece. It's bordering Attica, Opuntian Locris, and Phocis. So it sort of sits, if you travel from the Venice towards Delphi or the northern Greece along land route, you always have to cross through it. You can't really get around it if you don't go across the Gulf of Corinth. So it's quite a strategically placed region. It borders the sea on each side. It has the Gulf of Corinth to the south and the Strait of Eubea to the north. So it's sort of mountains on each side and water on the other sides. Now, in classical antiquity, there was a large lake in the middle of it. The lake is no longer there. And it was actually not there in the Bronze Age either, because at that point it did have quite a complex sort of draining system, which some of the myths I'll be talking about in a second actually deals with why the lake sort of returned in a way. But it's quite interesting to sort of travel around and walking around these areas, knowing that in antiquity this was a giant lake. Now, the Boeotians as a people is quite interesting. Like many other Greek groups, they have a mythical origin story where they claim to have migrated to the region, or depending on which fragment and source you look at, sometimes returned, because there's nothing better than recreating the myth. And in some ways, we are actually a Thomas and actually we are first. But in other versions, they are originating in Thessaly and moving to Boeotia following the Trojan War. What makes this region particularly interesting is sort of study for federal integration, and not just federal integration, but regional integration as a whole, is the fact that in the Iliad, Boeotia is actually split into two. There's one Boeotian region, so you go back to the previous map, and the region sort of northwest of Lake Opais was the Minian region, and the region down here was the Boeotian region. There's two separate regions in the Iliad. You can have a lot of discussion about whenever you think the catalog of ships was finished, but as long as we agree that when it was finished, Boeotia was still two separate identity groups. My personal sort of theory I'm working with is the 6th century, and largely following Gregory Nagi's dating of it. And it's an interesting time to put it. Now, this is where I sort of get into sort of a little bit of one of these first myths, which is the rivalry between King Erginus of Orchomenus and Heracles. Now, Erginus is a king of the minions of Orchomenus, and he wants to avenge his father's death, who's died in some sports games at Onchestos, where Thebes is an important Poseidon temple within Boeotia. He wins the first battle. Heracles eventually sort of comes to Boeotia. In Boeotian settings, Heracles is always a Theban. He's always a Theban national hero, or at least in the vast majority of cases, he's kind of their ethnic hero, which is why I have the picture that's at the bottom of there, which it doesn't look very grand, sort of grand now, but that is the ruins of the house of Heracles in Thebes. And on top again is the tallest tomb of Minyas, sort of symbolizing Erginus and the minions. But there's two sort of versions of what happens, actually three different versions of what happens. I have two of them on here because two of them are surely in the 6th century context, or what actually sort of happens following Heracles and Erginus fighting. Now, in one version, Erginus survives, he lives on to father people like Trophonius and Agamedes. Trophonius becomes a god in Western Boeotia eventually. And I'm actually working on an article that is submitted in a couple of weeks' time that deals with sort of Erginus and Trophonius and Minian identity in Levadia, which is the city where Trophonius' sanctuary was. Now, throughout that period, in that version of the myth, Orchomenus remains a weakened player. So Thebes sort of starts beginning the dominance of the region. That's one 6th century version, quite likely to be the Theban version of it. Now, we look to a fragment from Pherecydes of Athens. You have a slightly different version, in which Erginus survives, manages to rebuild the power of Orchomenus, and actually wages war on Thebes later against Oedipus. So you have two different narratives happening, two different mythical stories, one Orchomean, one Theban. But the important thing to sort of take from that is, by the end of the 6th century, we have seen there been conflict between them that's recorded mostly in the archaeological records. There's battles between various groups taking place in the area around Hittios, Tanagra, Coronea, so various Boeotian cities, probably as a conflict between Boeotians and Minians. by the end of this century, the Minions is integrated into the Boeotian regional group. And it has these two strands of the myth sort of happening. In ancient Greek myth history, there is not necessarily a problem to have two conflicting narratives, which is quite interesting, really, that you can have two conflicting narratives at the same time. What's important is that you can kind of play them into various local contexts, and the local people sort of have their own variety of it in many ways. But anyway, at this point, the commoners and the other Minion areas is largely incorporated. These myths sort of symbolizes kind of their, in some ways, subjugation, in some ways, incorporation into the Boeotian region. And the interesting thing is, by the end of the 6th century, the evidence we do have suggests some sort of regional collaboration. Not enough that we will call it a federation at this point, or a federal state at this point. Just putting that out there. There's a lot of debate about this, sort of a couple of, like a decade or so ago, about Boeotian federalism in the 6th century, but I'm not sure we can go quite that far. But the interesting thing here is you have this integration of the Minions into the Boeotians, and it gets reflected in the fact that there's multiple versions of this one. I said there was a third version. In the third version, Heracles just straight out kills Erginus. So Erginus doesn't actually survive. In that version, Trophonius becomes the son of Apollo, which is also quite an old genealogy, but in that version, that becomes the leading one. And in that version is likely sort of more to date from the moment that Achaemenus tried to rebel against the Thebans in the 4th century. So that was more a political consequence at that point, is not becoming a sort of established theory around that. We do actually also have another sort of mythical integration represented of the Minions becoming Boeotians and becoming part of the system. In a sort of obscure scholar to Apollonius Rhodes, we have this really fun story where all of a sudden Achaemenus, the eponymous of the city with the same name, all of a sudden is the grandson of Boethus, the eponym of Boeotia. So they get integrated into this wider regional narrative. And there's another very interesting example of that I will get to in a moment. But having said that, with Boethus there, the main Boeotian sort of ethnic narrative, there's multiple versions of this genealogy because, let's face it, most Greek heroes have conflicting genealogies in one way or another. But this is one that I've been looking a lot into, the Aeolian genealogy that ties them back to Thessaly. In this version, there's a migration of Thessaly sometime after Trojan War, roughly about 60 years. It was often sort of estimated by the sources that this mythical story would have developed. Not to say that it didn't happen or that it did happen, it's just very hard to actually prove. Instead, it's better to say that for the Boeotians in the sort of archaic and classical period, the importance lies in the fact that they believed it happened and that this is a part of their migration narrative versus their identity. According to these stories, they were led to the region by Boethus from a city called Arne, which also happens to be the name of the mother of Boethus. So we have this links between the place back in Thessaly, a place that is mentioned in archaic textual sources, not been located yet. So there's a discussion about whether it actually existed or not. But again, for the Boeotians and for the ethnic narrative of the Boeotians and the integration of the region, it's more important to think they believed it happened. Therefore, it's important for them rather than say that it didn't happen, so therefore it isn't important. In this one, they do then have the link back to Thessaly with Arne. They have the link to the Hellenes as Arne's father was Aeolus, so you have sort of the linking into the wider Hellenic system and into the Aeolians, and a link to a god in forms of Poseidon, which is the father of Boethus in this particular genealogies. As I said, there's more of them. I just chose to highlight this one in this talk. Arne also becomes the name of the first city in Boeotia. So you have then this city that's founded in Boeotia that links back to the homeland and back to the mythical mother of their eponymous hero. The picture that's down here is from the Fortress of Gla, which is, I think, one of the largest Mycenaean fortresses that is in Greece. We don't know the actual sort of name for it because the records don't survive. But it's fascinating that we don't know it, considering the magnitude of this place. I went around there on this trip and just looked around. It took me quite a while to sort of walk around and look at all the details. Fascinating place. But it's one of the places that is speculated to be Arne in Boeotia. Now, the Grecian Federation itself is from around 447. And we have this fragment from the Hellenic historian, which says that Thebes contributed 4, 2 from the city of Plataea. At this point, Plataea is integrated into the Theban territories, and you have a district for Commodus and Hysia, which is more likely to be Hittite, so that's a different argument we can go into. Tanagra had a district, and some places share districts, such as Salyatis, Levadia, and Cronea. But it's interesting because it is the federation we know in most details. The federation that's represented in this fragment is more likely to date to the late 5th century. I will briefly talk about that on the next slide and exactly why I think that. The federal state, the state formed around 447, formed after they collectively defeated the Athenians, who controlled the region for a decade. Now, Greece has a lot of power players. There's the Plataeans, as I already mentioned, small but quite often involved with the Athenians. You have Commodus, who was instrumental in defeating the Athenians, but not really big enough to take on the hegemony on their own at this point. Thebes is the largest polis, but with the sort of somewhat shame of the Persian War still hanging over them, as well as the unable to sort of defeat the Athenians a decade before, unlikely to sort of be in a hegemony that others would necessarily have accepted. Tanagra had a reduced influence following battles in their territory, a decade earlier, and Thespia was a traditional Athenian ally. So none of them really sort of in a place to take on the hegemony of the region and actually dominate the region politically. And all of these also are quite strong local identities, making it very hard to actually dominate the region and dominate other identity groups. Now, this is where you have this sort of interesting thing happening, where you have like where you do have a power distribution that I think is linked to the Trojan War, and I will mention that in a second. I would just say that again, what we see here is likely be a later 5th century version of the Federation. As the Plataea have been incorporated into the Theban district following their sort of gamble on the Athenian side in the dawn of the Peloponnesian War. And Cronea seemed to have been under Achaemenid influence as it started with as the Peloponnesian War started and the Federation began its life. But by the mid to late Peloponnesian War, they seem to have sort of formed a district alongside Akratia and Kopai, which is interesting because eventually there's a link forming with Cronea also claims to be Arne. I mentioned which you see up here. It's often the one we think that archaeologists have speculated, but also Akratia down here claims to be Arne. So there's at least 2 cities in this and one modern sort of identification of Arne within this area. That forms a federal district, which, as you see, it's very split district, which is why I have arrows through the lake in this one. Interesting thing for me here is there's 7 districts here in total. Those 7 districts, whilst it's hard to sort of prove it exactly, I think that might match up with the 7 leaders of the Boeotians during the Trojan War. The reason being, they need, when they form this unified state, a sort of proud history to look back at, and they need to sort of start forming some sort of shared identity. And the Trojan War is one place where Greeks often look to. Another place Greeks often look to is the Persian War. However, that is not a good place for the Boeotians to go because they have, they picked the wrong side. So, except Plataea and Thespia. So they couldn't really look back to the Persian War narrative. So instead, my theory is that they look further back and they look to the narrative of the Trojan War. Now, in this, you have in the Iliad, you have 2 Manian and 5 Boeotians, which makes of those 7, which comes to form these districts. If this is correct, we can see an ideological and existential use of history that's used to construct the federal system based on the cultural memory of the last time they in the recorded sort of idea was a unified, on a unified side in a winning conflict alongside the other Hellenes. So it's quite an interesting sort of thing to look at. Again, this bit is quite speculative at this point, but I hope to sort of find more about this. I mentioned Coronea was an interesting example as it sort of separated out from the Comenian region during the Peloponnesian War and links itself to Arne back to the Boeotian origin story and also towards Acrafia and that sort of Lake Opais region. And in many ways, that claims to be the first city funded by the Boeotians, which is quite a cool claim to have if you're going to be a part of this federal system. But if this is correct, then you have a system where they use the Trojan War as a tool for federal integration across the region. You have mythical links to Arne, which incorporates into sort of a larger regional framework where we see Coronea claiming that identity. We know Acrafia also has a link to that. The source of this is it's quite late, but it is a sort of stories that would have been known and used also in the classical period. And you have examples such as Erginus and Heracles, where you see the integration of Orchomenus into the regional collaboration of the Boeotians. And this coin is slightly later than sort of things I've talked about here, but it is a coin from Orchomenus that does have the Boeotian shield on it. It's a 4th century coin. Another image of Plataea, which is just a wonderful sight. And with that, I sort of given a brief introduction to Boeotia, and I'm going to go over to the Aetolians, which is quite an interesting region as well. And you see the first picture here comes from Calydon, a fantastic temple ruin in the region, well worth visiting. Again, very few people ever go to Aetolia, so you have a good chance of just being able to walk around this ruin on your own if you sort of really want to. This is from the Artemis temple that's there, looking towards the mountain, and on the other side you have the Pactus and towards Boeotia and Attica and all of that. Now, Anatolia is in western Greece, is north of the Gulf of Corinth, and is in the Pindus Mountains, so some very serious mountains in Aetolia, which is why it seems in very early genealogical myths that there is separation between two groups. One Aetolian group one Aetolian group at the coast, and one in the inland. I'm not going to talk too much about the genealogies because, again, if I start talking about Aetolian genealogies, we'll never get out of here this evening. So it's split into these regions, which is quite evident for quite early on. At one point, part of it is even called Aeolis rather than Aetolia, which is quite interesting. We do know there's quite early regional collaboration in this one, and we do know that Thermon, the image, the temple that was on my very first slide, is one of the earliest temples in the Greek world that remained in use for the longest time. And I think it was only really sort of sacked during the Hellenistic period when they were in war with Macedon. They border also then Locris, Acarnania, Dolopia, Hotea, and a whole bunch of other regions, and they expand actually to include a lot of other things, which is what I'll be talking about, other regions around them, which is what I'll be talking about in a moment. First, say a little bit about the archaic and classical Aetolia. Here we have those two important sanctuaries of the region, the Artemis Temple at the top, the Apollo Sanctuary at the bottom. It's a coastal region included in the catalogue of ships. At that point, it's literally only the polis along the coast as mentioned, so that is sort of the focus on Homeric Aetolia quite often lies. We do know they're not involved in the Persian Wars. They are actually quite sort of referred to in a lot of myths. So they, in the Caledonian Borhan, for instance, they're mentioned. A lot of it actually takes place around Calydon. So they are sort of quite prominent in myth, but seems to sort of disappear out in the classical period. Now that is until Athens decides, on the advice of some of their allies, to try to sort of do a little invasion of the region. It goes horribly wrong. The Aetolians chases them out, using what we today probably call guerrilla warfare. The Aetolians are very fascinating in the sense that they are quite often scholars have talked about them as a relatively weak group in the classical period. My assumption is actually that they are actually quite a strong group in the period. One, they chased out Athenians here. Two, at one point in the 4th century, the Spartan king needs permission to walk through the territories as stated in Xenophon. So they are quite a sort of interesting region from that sort of perspective for quite early on. But after the Athenian invasion of the region, they were referred to as half-barbarians, raw meat eaters. One of their groups is speakers of unintelligible dialects. So you have this sort of whole reputation that goes against them from Attic writers for a while, and then obviously Polybius in the Hellenistic period kind of doesn't like them either. So a lot of the memory we have of them is quite sort of full of these narratives from outside sources that isn't their biggest fans. Now, in 367, we have an inscription that indicates a federal state. It's kind of the earliest evidence of it. They mention there's a koinon in there. And as we go through the late classical period, which obviously should say Aetolia there in Boeotia, you have a rapid expansion beginning, and it becomes this major power play on the Hellenic mainland. And with that, I'm going to start with the mythical integration bit there, with a sort of rather interesting story I discovered during my doctoral studies, which is a ghost story. That refers to sort of events that we now think occurred sort of either in the 4th or the mid-3rd century. I think the myth sort of based on events in the 4th century, sort of towards the end of that, and eventually developed into a ghost story. Obviously, it wasn't quite this sort of mythical story to begin with, but eventually it became. According to this story, which mainly survives in Phlegon, the Trials and Proclus, just saying, and Resepka has sort of speculated that the earlier sort of written record that these are based on is from the 3rd century, and it might be older than that as well. But in the early sort of, the story basically goes that there's a new strategos of Aetolia called Polycretus. Now, he marries an Ausolian Locrian woman, but then poor Polycretus dies as his wife is pregnant. So he never gets to live to see this baby born. The baby is born as an intersex child. It has both genitalia. This panics the local people. They don't really know what to do, so they call a assembly. They have an assembly to discuss what to do, and there's sort of speculation like, oh, this might mean the split of us and the Ausolians, because there's sort of a process of integration already starting here. However, as they sort of have this discussion and they sort of agree that we need to kill this baby, the ghost of Polycretus appears. And he says, don't do that. Of course, the assembly isn't listening, so what does the ghost father do? Well, he eats the baby, except the head. The head then speaks a prophecy. And this is meant to symbolize unification of Aetolia and Ausolian-Locrius. A unification that lasted, because when Thessalius went around Ausolian-Locrius in the much later, he was actually told that we're not Ausolians, we are Aetolians. So you have this sort of thing that survives. Very weird mythical story to sort of symbolize unification. It also talks about the War of Acarnania, so that's either then in the 4th century or the 3rd century. Again, I'm working with the 4th century date. But it's a very sort of interesting existential unification myth that develops there. And it's just one that I find very fascinating. Yes, so that's the first sort of story of unification of integration I'll go into with the Aetolian. The big thing with Aetolia is not following this. We do have a rapid expansion. It begins at this period, it begins with the Ausolian-Locrius, and it then starts to gradually incorporate other bits, such as Heraclea Tocinia, for reasons gets integrated, some with force, some voluntarily. So there's various ways this happened. But now, in 279, the Gauls arrive on the stage, and you have the Gallic invasion of Greece. This is where the Aetolians really start to rise to prominence. So they took a leading role in the defense of Delphi, and following multiple regions joined the federation. Not just following the successful defense of Aetolia, but also Delphi, central Greece. Now, if you see the map there, you see sort of the dark outline that goes around, that shows their expansion, which at this point includes parts of Phocis, Thessaly, and Brachia. So it's quite a sort of big expansion that happens. This is how they become as powerful they are. The interesting thing that happens with this narrative is, and I don't remember exactly where I read it, but there's a scholar who's called the way we now think of the Gallic War as worryingly Herodotean. It became very Persian War-like. So here the Aetolians build themselves into a story similar to the Persian Wars, portray themselves as defenders of the Hellenic mainland and of Delphi. And through that, start to raise the prominence on the Hellenic stage again after the Athenians had spent quite a while trying to make them into being half barbarians. So they sort of have this sort of rise in it, and we have this represented in texts such as Callimachus' Hymn to Delos, where we have the references to dedications that was donated at Delphi following the war. Again, near where the Athenians dedicated their shields at the end of the Persian Wars. So they sort of Aetolians put themselves more into this position. The Aetolians aren't directly mentioned in the hymn to Delos, but they were the ones who led the defenses. Therefore, when you read that hymn and you see sort of in a way where the goals sort of fits in a version of the Titans, you have the Hellenes as the Olympians under the leadership of the Aetolians. So you have this sort of really interesting dynamic happening here. And then they do this really, really interesting thing when it comes to sort of beginning this very rapid expansion, this claim to Aetolian greatness on the Hellenic mainland. They set up a statue of Aetolia as a heroine at Delphi, which raises their profile in the Hellenic wider stage, and also a Thermon, which in many ways is their key sanctuary themselves. So they do this so they sort of pull themselves up in their own regions and link it to Delphi. They link themselves to the center of the Greek world in many ways. And they keep doing this. So in 246, they reorganize a festival called the Satira, literally referring to victory at Delphi. And so to sort of celebrate their victory of the Gauls. But said the name symbolizes the victory. We see a long range of this festival. We see people from Athens, Chios, Tenos, Cycladic Islands. So multiple places across the Greek world takes part in this. And the Aetolians sort of really starts to redevelop the narrative of who they are after sort of all this bad press in the classical period. And the interesting thing with that is that they're not the only ones to do this. There's multiple Satira festivals being put up at other places as the Gauls are being beaten. So the Macedonians makes one in a different location. So there's multiple of these happening. This festival takes place at Delphi. It has been referred to by some other scholars as the Aetolians using sort of the past as a propaganda tool. And in some ways, I think that there might be something to that. This is not the only festival the Aetolians develop. They also develop a festival called the Pan-Aetolican. It's the date slightly earlier than this Satira festival, which is a festival specifically to celebrate and integrate the members into federations. It's sort of a hope to develop a federal ethnic, that means develop a shared identity across it. An interesting thing with the Pan-Aetolica is that it's always celebrated outside Aetolia proper, so in the Pactus, as well as other regions across that ends up joining it. The coin you see on top, this lovely gold coin, does feature the image of Aetolia and the classification of the region as a goddess. It's a fascinating thing to do if you're going to use the mythical past to do that at this point. Now, during the social war, poets from many parts of the Hellenic world, they redeveloped mythical narratives, enhancing the Aetolian role in their stories. And we see that in the Candros, where a lot of the work surviving comes from Antonius Liberalis, who provides several stories related to regions that joins the Aetolians. I'm not going to actually read out all of these stories, but this says a little bit of the magnitude there, because Antonius Liberalis often gives Nicandros as one of his sources. Nicandros is one of the poets we know the Aetolians brought in to sort of start developing links to other regions, particularly in the years following the social war. These that are listed here, they are ones that Ian Rutherford thinks could be tied into Aetolians directly. The interesting thing with it is that it does have someone like Cycnus of Calydon, which is obviously already associated with Aetolia, but also Cragulus of Dryops, which draws into Ambracia, the Cragylidae and Phocians, Dryopians, Ambracians, so multiple groups. I think from what we can see in the work of Antoninus Liberalis, we can see more groups that's also associated with Aetolia sort of being written into the Aetolian narrative and sort of becoming a part, trying to make them a part of this bigger federal system and this federal identity. You, for instance, have a mention of the Minions, which is, as I already mentioned, in Western Boeotia. And you have the story of the border between Puntian, Locris, and Phocis that sort of has similar sources given. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic that happens. Nicandros is just one of the many poets that writes about Aetolia at this point. We have Amsterdam is another one. The big problem is that very little of their actual text survives, and we're very dependent on fragments to try to recreate this Anatolian use of the mythical past to write themselves into the wider Pan-Hellenic narratives. Uh, my favorite is where they sort of claims that the Ortygia that's in the birth story of Apollo and Artemis actually is in Anatolia. So you have all of these things happening. They're using myths to sort of reframe identity within these areas and integrate the various regions into the federation. So we can then ask ourselves, why does myth matter for federalism in the ancient Greek world? I have sort of a very lightly touched on a few. I could talk on forever about loads of it, but I'm sure I've also put some people to sleep if I did. But I just touched sort of on some light ones and easy ones here, and some rather peculiar ones like the baby eating ghost. It's a weird integration story there. Now, federal states, they're not only built to the laws and institutions, but they also often have a shared identity that's built through stories. They're built to shared festivals, shared cultural elements, and shared links to the past. And I think we see that in modern federations as well, to some extent, because there is quite clearly some sort of cohesion, of ethnic cohesion in, say, Germany or Switzerland. Also in the United States, you can argue it. You can even argue that some of the states in themselves has ethnic characteristics in how they define their own identities. Uh, but the mythical past, it produced kind of a common language of identity and belonging. And with myths being flexible, as in antiquity as today, then we have a sort of whole new generation rewriting a lot of the myths. Uh, they work as kind of an organism where that can sort of help to form and shape identities at various times. Because narratives, they can always be altered and rewritten to fit changing political needs, changing political developments, and the way a story is told in one generation does not have to be the same in the next one, even if it's the same story. It doesn't have to be interpreted in the same way. That's sort of the beauty of myth, isn't it? It constantly changes, often to change identity. Therefore, I say that the success of federations depended not only on political structures, but also in their ability to convince people that they share a common past. Now, I will say there that that is not always enough, because the Arcadian Federation collapsed quite quickly after it developed, and the Arcadians do have quite a deep myth of origin, but they just have very strong localized identities, and Mantinea and Tegea didn't agree enough to keep it going, really. The images on the end here kind of symbolizes these sort of mythical stories in some ways. At the bottom, you have the Zeus temple at Stratos. Again, beautiful site, which is not even set up as sort of a visitor attraction. You sort of just have to follow a path between two buildings, and all of a sudden there is this fantastic ruin, uh, which was the sort of main temple of the Acarnanians that's just next to the Aetolians, also had their own federal state for a while. And on the very top, we have the House of Cadmus. Obviously, when we think of Theban origin stories and Theban myths and Theban identity, that is a story that is one of the key aspects of their local identity within Boeotia and the wider Hellenic world. And it's just a fantastic site in the middle of the town. And with that, I hope you have enjoyed, and I'm open for some questions.
Thank you so much indeed, Thomas. That was really, really interesting. I'll just stop the recording.